Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. On this solemn occasion, the House of the Ten Commandments in Manama, Kingdom of Bahrain, has a special message for the Jewish world, that the Abrahamic Accords have signaled a rebirth of our synagogue, a synagogue that lay dormant since 1948. My father, Allah yarhamu, explained that in the 1930s and 40s, the synagogue was very lively with prayers and singing during the festivals, and with local participation by the Muslim families who grew up side by side with the Jewish families. The synagogue was a center for education for the children. Our much loved Rabbi Jacob Cohen looked after the community when no one could use the synagogue. And he learned how to be a rabbi from Shimon Cohen, who originally established the center in 1935, with the help of Messrs. Rosenthal and Pack, who were wealthy pearl merchants. A special mention must be made about Rabbi Shimon Cohen, Allah yarham. He was here in the 1930s and found a group of 800 to 850 Jewish traders who lacked knowledge of how to pray and how to read Hebrew. He went about establishing the synagogue and teaching the youngsters, two of whom were my father and Jacob Cohen, Allah yarham. And he taught them how to pray properly and how to read Hebrew properly. Yesterday, I witnessed in this very synagogue a mincha prayer with a minyan, and it was a special feeling. If Shimon Cohen or Jacob Cohen or our new fathers were alive today, how happy they would be to see this rebirth. I would like to introduce our guest speaker, Ambassador Dore Gold. He is president of the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs. Ambassador Gold was the 11th permanent representative of Israel to the United Nations from 97 to 99. He also served as the Director General of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Israel in 2015 to 2016. In that capacity, he was instrumental in expanding Israel's ties in the Arab world, the Far East, and in Africa. In January 2014, he was appointed as an external advisor on international issues to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. During the Prime Minister Netanyahu's first term, and in the capacity of foreign policy, Ambassador Gold served as an envoy to the Palestinian Authority, to Egypt, Jordan, and the Gulf states. Ambassador Gold has written books on the Middle East and articles which have appeared in major international publications. Among his New York Times bestseller, The Fight for Jerusalem, stems from his sense of mission to disprove those who engage in temple denial, or who otherwise dispute the Jewish people's historical connection with Jerusalem. This drive inspired his creation of a multimedia presentation, which he has delivered at venues including the United States Senate in Washington, D.C., in London, Los Angeles, New York, and Jerusalem. As a recognized scholar and senior diplomat, Ambassador Gold is regularly invited to share his expertise. He delivered testimony at the US House of Representatives before two special congressional hearings, one on recognizing Israeli sovereignty on the Golan Heights in 2018, another on moving the American embassy to Jerusalem in 2017, and before the Foreign Affairs Committee in the US House of Representatives to testify on Israel's right to defensible borders. In 2010, he was invited by the Office of the Prosecutor to the International Criminal Court in The Hague to discuss the Palestinian Authority's declarations recognizing ICC jurisdiction in territories that it claimed. Earlier in 2009, he debated Justice Richard Goldstone at Brandeis University on the veracity of the United Nations fact-finding mission on the Gaza conflict. He earned his BA in 1975, MA in 1976, and PhD in 1984 from Columbia University, where he specialized in the Middle East and international law. He lives in Jerusalem with his wife, Ofra, their children, and he's blessed with grandchildren. Thank you very much for joining us, Ambassador Gold.
Well, thank you. And before I get started, I really want to acknowledge your synagogue, the House of the Ten Commandments, and how this event, which is really a historical event, it's the first time that you are commemorating in Bahrain Yom HaShoah. And I think we have to mark that, not just get into the academic and historical aspects of it, but really stop for a minute and say to ourselves, wow. And I particularly want to thank three people: yourself, Abi Nunu, Huda, the former ambassador to the United States, Huda Nunu, and Nancy Kaduri, who I understand is on this, is involved in this event, and everybody else in the congregation who really took the trouble to make this happen. So thank all of you, and let this be only a beginning of many years of cooperation. Let me get started with tonight's event. 5 years ago, when I served as Director General of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Israel, I actually stood in the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp in Germany on Yom HaShoah, where I was asked to speak. There were good reasons to focus on Bergen-Belsen. It had emerged as one of the key concentration camps established by the Nazi regime for the purpose of exterminating the Jews of Europe. It had no gas chambers like the Nazi-run death camps at Auschwitz and Treblinka in Poland. Yet thousands died in Bergen-Belsen from disease, starvation, exposure, and sheer exhaustion, especially after the death marches in the winter of 1944-1945 from the evacuated camps in the east. Typhus and typhoid fever were rampant. Thus, Bergen-Belsen's role grew as a central hub of the concentration camp system after the Red Army crushed the Wehrmacht along the Eastern Front, and the Germans transferred their surviving Jewish prisoners to camps within the borders of the German state. Jews from all over the Nazi Empire were forced into Bergen-Belsen, from Poland, Hungary, Yugoslavia, the Netherlands, France, as well as North African states like Libya and Tunisia. The commandant of the Bergen-Belsen camp at the end of 1944 was Joseph Kramer, who was an SS officer who previously had been in charge of the main killing center at Auschwitz. On a personal note, let me add, my own mother-in-law, Dina Sherman, was also relocated from Auschwitz to Bergen-Belsen, along with her sister Esther, who died in her arms in that place. It was also where Anne Frank died with her sister Margot after they were moved from Auschwitz, along with tens of thousands of others. 5 days after the British Army liberated Bergen-Belsen, on April 15th, 1945, a BBC reporter named Richard Dimbleby entered the camp and made a tape recording of the former Jewish prisoners congregating on a Friday night, rising up with their very frail bodies and breaking into a Hebrew song. called Hatikva, which means the hope. It was to become Israel's national anthem. That very moment in time forged a link between the horrors of the concentration camps and the restoration of Israel just a few years later. By choosing Hatikva, the Jews at Bergen-Belsen were also reminding the world and sending a message that theirs was a 2,000-year-old hope that dated back to when the Jews lived as a free people in their own land. They were also saying that it was time to go back home. What has the modern state of Israel learned from the horrors of Bergen-Belsen and the Holocaust more generally? Chaim Herzog served as an officer in the British forces that entered Bergen-Belsen in 1945. In April 1987, he went back there as Israel's 6th president and directed his words to the victims in their graves. He declared that they bequeathed a responsibility to later generations to ensure that the Jewish people would never again be helpless. That meant, first, that we will never allow anyone to do this to us again. In modern times, there's a new anti-Semitic wind blowing across Europe, reviving memories of what transpired on that continent decades ago. But there is a real physical threat to the Jewish people that emanates from a regime in the Middle East that parades missiles in its capital nearly every year and fastens to its launchers the words, quote, Israel must be wiped off the map. You cannot wipe a country off the map without posing an existential threat to the people who live there. The reports of the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, since 2011 have added that the same regime is aspiring to remove the conventional warhead from the very same missile that it parades and replacing it with, quote, a spherical nuclear payload. Not much is left to the imagination. Israel will deter and defend against any state or political movement which poses a threat to the Jewish people. This is not an obsession, but a sacred trust handed to us by the people buried under the rubble of the Second World War. The legacy for Israel and the Jewish people from the Holocaust is not only in the military field. Since the end of the Second World War, Jewish judges and Jewish lawyers stood at the forefront of the international struggle against genocide in any form, in any context. It was a Jewish jurist named Raphael Lemkin who in fact coined the term genocide. It was another Jewish scholar, René Cassin, who had a pivotal role in drafting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights for the United Nations. Shabtai Rosen fought for the creation of an international criminal court, the ICC, though it became tragically corrupted by states that sought to politicize it shortly after it was founded. Despite these and similar legal efforts, however, the threat of genocide has persisted since the Second World War. In Cambodia, in Rwanda, in Bosnia, in Darfur, and across the Middle East, in Kurdistan and in Syria. Israel is a small state, but Israeli diplomacy must do everything in its power to recognize the warning signs and the threats of genocide, and then to mobilize and press states to prevent it. That is an enormous responsibility. But as the survivors of the greatest crime in human history, we must bear that burden and undertake to banish this threat from the family of nations. As a final note, Fighting genocide requires advancing tolerance and mutual understanding between peoples. I'm extremely aware that I'm giving this address in Bahrain. In the 19th century, East African slaves in the Persian Gulf escaped to Bahrain, where they knew they would be freed. While many nations evicted their Jews during the Holocaust, that did not happen in Bahrain. His Majesty King Hamad bin Isa al Khalifa has stood for outreach and tolerance between peoples and civilizations. Bahrain is actually located on a strategic seam between the Arab world and Iran. Most leaders in such a situation would be paralyzed into inaction. But what did King Hamad do? You know what he did? He made peace with Israel and took a leading role with the states that signed the Abraham Accords. He established the King Hamad Global Center for Peaceful Coexistence in 2018 and opened new doors by being the first country in the Arab world to adopt the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. This is not just smart diplomacy. It's an act of real political courage, which we must always recall and for which we will honor his historical role. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Gold, for giving us a piece of history. In the House of Ten Commandments, the Jewish community of Bahrain is participating for the first time in the Yellow Candle Project, which is the global communal effort to remember victims of the Holocaust. Members from each community around the world will light a yellow candle in memory of the names of Jews who perished during the Shoah. The project includes an educational website which allows participants to explore age-appropriate themes within Holocaust education. Daniel Cohen, a member of the Bahraini Jewish community, and my cousin will be reciting El Malay Rachamim, which is a plea that the soul of the departed should be granted a proper rest. After the prayer, we will together, both in person and virtually, each light a candle in memory of the deceased.
This is the memorial prayer for the 6 million who perished in the Holocaust. Al Malay Rachamim Shochen Bamromim, Hamatzeh Manucha Nochona, Al Kanfei Hashchina, Bamaalot Kadoshim Uthorim, Kazoha Harakia, Ashirim Et Nishmot, Akdoshim Bahathorim, Shahumutu Vesheneheru, Veshenish, Khatu, Veshenis Rafu, Veshenit Bahu, Veshenech Nahu, Al Kudush Hashem, Al Yedeh Hasororim, Agar Manim. Yemach Shemam Zikram Ba'avoshe Kal Hakahal, Et Alim Ba'ad Hasparat Ishmotehem, Began Eden Tehe, Menu Khatam Lachem Ba'al Harachamim. Yatzki Ram B'Seiter Kanafav La'alamin, Vayitro B'Tro HaChayim Et Nishmotehem, Adonai Hu Nachlatam, V'Yenuchu B'Shalom Al Mishkavotehem V'Nomar Amen. O God full of mercy, who dwells on high, grant proper rest on the wings of the divine presence, in the lofty levels of the holy and the pure ones, who shine like the glow of the firmament. For the souls of the holy and pure ones who were killed, murdered, slaughtered, burned, drowned, and strangled for the sanctification of the name through the hands of the German oppressors. May their name and memory be obliterated, because the whole congregation is praying on their behalf in remembrance of their souls. May their resting place be in the Garden of Eden. Therefore may the Master of Mercy shelter them in the shelter of his wings for eternity, and may he bind their souls in the bond of life. The Lord is their heritage, and may they repose in peace on their resting place. Now let us say Amen.
We are lighting these candles, these yellow candles, in memory of the following. Anusia Binky, of Lords who perished in Auschwitz, age 7. Aaron Byron, who perished, age 10.
I'm lighting this yellow candle in memory of Haja Berman of Bonn Fehonyard, who perished at Auschwitz in 1944, aged 6.
Stone, who perished at the age of 8. Rivka Berenbaum, who perished at the age of 38.
Randall Biner, who perished at age 43. Rachel Binyonskaya, who perished at the age of 10.
Moshe Berensweig, who perished at age 32.
This brings us to the end of our event. Thank you all for joining us this evening as we gathered for the first public Yom HaShoah commemoration in Bahrain. We thank you all for your support, and we look forward to gathering again for happier occasions. Once again, thank you to Ambassador Dore Gold. If you have taken any pictures from the event, please use #YellowCandle to accompany your photos. Have a good evening. Thank you so much. Goodbye.